Hey, a recent survey showed that 94% of all DevOps teams that responded suffered a security incident over the last 12 months. And the biggest spot or part of the pipeline or application lifecycle where the security incident happened was at runtime. And especially as they evolve infrastructure and scale applications and so on, it's hard to keep up with the security, right? So let's see how you can solve that in a scalable manner today. Red Hat recently issued a report on the security state of Kubernetes. They interviewed a ton of DevOps teams, and it was crazy to see that 94% of the teams that responded to the survey mentioned that they had a security incident over the last 12 months. The report also breaks down kind of the different issues that they had from a security perspective, such as services exposing ports they shouldn't, or communicating with services that they should not be communicating, security vulnerabilities, as well as applications failing to comply with internal policies. They also show kind of the breakdown between the different stages of your pipeline or of your application lifecycle. And it was mind-boggling to see that almost half of the issues happen at runtime. And at the end, this is not super surprising, right? Because security policies, they change based on applications, based on times, and as you evolve your infrastructure. And now the question comes, how can you avoid those security incidents? And especially as you keep scaling the number of clusters, developers, pipelines, and applications being deployed to these clusters. I'm sure your requirements are going to change over time, and keep going to infrastructure or cluster-centric type of rules. It's going to be complex to scale. It's going to be complex to address the requirements. And as you evolve, going back to security and management with changed policies and showing in real life and on demand how the change in security policies affects your applications, it's impossible. So today, in just a few minutes, we're going to show you how you can quickly specify a policy without having to write any complex rule or any cluster-centric rule, and connect these policies to the different clusters you have, different applications, and start identifying potential security issues across networking, security, application placement, and so on, in a way that no other application can help you do that and in a scalable manner. Let's see it. Let's see what we have here. I have broken it down into two different environments. The first one is a GKE that I'll assume it's my dev environment, and the second one is an EKS that I'll treat it as a production environment. I have different applications. I have a Magento app and a WordPress application deployed on my development environment, and I have a WordPress application deployed in my production environment. Originally, I used Helm to deploy these applications, but you can assume that these applications have been deployed using Flux CD, Argo CD, Terraform, Crossplane, Pulumi, or whatever suits your use case, but these applications are running in my cluster. So now I'm asked by my management team to see how these applications perform against internal policies that we have. And keep in mind that many times the scenario that we have is this application is going to be owner 1, this application is going to be owner 2, and this application is going to be owner 3. And as you can see, they have different environments, are potentially coming from different Git repositories and so on. So ideally, I should be able to define a policy for each application with the different security requirements that I have, and I should instantly see how these applications they perform against these different policies, how they comply or violate with these policies. Not only that, but as I mentioned before, your policies are going to evolve over time. You're going to have new applications, new clusters, and so on. And how can you keep on adjusting these policies, for example, to comply with your security changes, and see instantly how these applications they comply with your policy changes. The problem is that with most security solutions that you would find out there, you would have to write infrastructure level or cluster level security policies, for example, with complex language, for example, or new languages, or you would have to write for cluster specific API version and so on. And as you scale, it will become difficult to maintain. Also, as you onboard more security folks or DevOps or platform engineering folks or new managers, they want to see how these policies, how your applications comply with these policies, are going to become extremely hard. So you want something that is application level that you can quickly update, and you're not writing for a cluster, you're writing for your application security posture. Let's see how you can do it. All right, now we understand the challenges that we have to tackle, and we understand the infrastructure we have across the different clusters. Let's see it in action, right? As mentioned, I have my EKS cluster and I have my GKE clusters already running here. And if I go to my terminal, I can see the namespaces I have in one of my clusters. My kubectl is connected to my GKE cluster. So let's start with staging. I'm going to be using Shipa to bring out the insights or discover my applications and point how my applications they comply or they violate my security. If you don't have an account on Shipa, you can create one for free, and everything that we're doing here is free. You can create one on apps.shipa.cloud. And I'm going to be creating what Shipa calls a policy framework, which is basically how we're going to discover the application, connect to your cluster, and surface the policy violations. If I come into frameworks and I choose create, for example, you have different options here, but let's focus on discover existing applications. This will allow us to connect Shipa to our clusters and discover the applications we have, as well as how they comply or violate our security policies. If we click on next, it's going to ask us for a name. We can start with a Magento, for example, and let's say dev, right? The second one is going to be the plan, and this is plans are used by Shipa to show how limit how much applications can consume from a resource perspective, so CPU and memory. I have a couple already created. You can use Shipa plan, which is a pre-created one if it's a new account, or you can create a couple. I'm gonna select production, for example, which has a certain limit of CPU and memory, and this will show how the applications discovered comply or not with the resource limits. The Kubernetes namespace, this is one that we need to adjust. So I'm gonna make sure that we mention Magento dev, for example, and that's the namespace I have here on my cluster. I want to make sure that I highlight the right namespace that Shipa should connect to in my cluster, so Shipa can discover the applications and perform whatever it has to do. So I'm going to keep here Magento dev, and the teams is going to be Shipa team. If you have multiple teams in your organization, development 1, 2, 3, or whatever way you break it down, you can add these teams on Shipa and assign these frameworks to these teams, so they only see the discovered applications that belongs to them. Good. Here I already have my GKE cluster connected, so I'll just say this framework should be connected to this cluster, which is my GKE cluster. EKS I'll show you in a second. Next is going to ask me to enter a label. So when I deployed my applications, my Helm chart assigned a label to my Magento application, right? If I go back here and I check kubectl, got pods on my Magento dev, I can see a few pods running. And if I describe it, Magento dev, for example, and I go up, I can see a few of the labels here that I can pick and use, right? So usually your Helm chart or customize or whatever you're using probably assign a few labels, and that's what you can use for Shipa to discover these applications. If you come here, then I'll select one, appcube kubernetes.io name, for example, which is one that I have here, and I'm gonna just add Magento dev, for example. So every application discovered by Shipa is going to be added a Magento dev at the end. When I click on create, what's going to happen is Shipa will connect to that namespace that we mentioned, and will start searching for applications with that label that we just mentioned. if you want to check the status, you can go to events, for example, and you can see cluster update is done. And in a few seconds, Shipa will start running the application discovery. Great. The second application we want to do or check is our WordPress dev. Remember? So if we click on create, we do the same thing. Discover applications. I'll do next. And if I go back to my terminal, I can do get pods WordPress dev. I have my application, my WordPress application running in there, and it has the same label. So if we go back to Shipa, I'm gonna say WordPress dev, for example. I'm gonna assign the name, the same plan, just to keep things easy. And I will make sure that again the namespace here reflects the right name, and they are in the same cluster. They already have there. So I'll do next. They share the same label, and here I would say WordPress dev. So it makes it easy for me to identify. Again, if this is to be owned by a different team, you could create a different team, add the users, and then as Shipa discovers the applications, you can assign the different teams in here, so they only see what they should see. When we go next, we do create, and the same thing is gonna happen here. So if we go here, for example, it's gonna run a cluster update, and we can see some app create events here. If we go to applications, we're gonna see our Magento apps have already been discovered, and I can click on it. I can find detailed information about the container images that are used by this app, this Magento app, the environment variables, endpoints where the application or the service is exposed. You can see information around kind of the object dependency map and the status, volumes, and you can see everything that your application needs to run, and the networks that that are exposed. So you can see that here it's basically exposed to everything, right? If we go now to our insights, and that's the part around the security, right? I can see that there are some policy violations in here. How much code or legal policies did I have to write? 0, right? How much did I have to learn the underlying Kubernetes API, write complex YAML? 0. It took me just a couple minutes to do this. And you can see here kind of the policy violations you have over time, deployment, and more metrics that we can cover later. But if we go into the details, I can see that my Elasticsearch here and my MariaDB for my Magento, they have security issues. And I can see my WordPress as well here. If we click here on one issues, I can see it's a resource limit policy. And I can see the violation where. And this is based on the framework that we just defined and connected to that cluster. If I check my WordPress app, I can probably see my WordPress. Yeah, it's already here. And if I come into Insights, I can see it here. It has 2 violations. And I can see, well, the violations are actually coming from resource limits. You're saying, Bruno, that it should only use this much memory or this much memory, for example, but it's actually requesting this or the CPU. So you can quickly identify that these apps are using more than it should. And you can also see that there are violations from network policy perspective. So there are a bunch of egress and ingress as well violations from a cluster perspective, which means your services are communicating in and out based on different policies, right? Great. It took me a few minutes, just a couple of minutes, didn't write anything connected to a cluster. I can quickly go back to management or my team or development or whoever and say, hey, we have violations across these different applications, and this is where the violations are. But let's say now my policy needs to evolve, right? Those are not the only security rules that I want to set and monitor. If I come back here and I check my Magento dev, for example, if I come and I say, well, you know what? Applications deployed on my Magento dev app should only come from Docker.io Shipa software. Anything other than that is just wrong, shouldn't be used in my cluster. If I update it, same process. If I come into events, it's gonna run a cluster update and it's gonna start showing the violations. If I come into insights, I can see now I have two issues, right? Different than before. If I go into view, I can see that these are actually pulling from where they should not. I'm saying from a policy framework perspective, should only come from Docker IO Shipa software, but this is where these containers are coming. This is awesome. If you want to quickly identify where these applications are coming from and violations, and you can keep on going, right? If you go to frameworks again and you change update and you say, hey, actually, my application, let me see one that is easy to identify and say, hey, applications should have a minimum of 5 replicas and maximum of 10, and they shouldn't be scaling when there's 85% CPU. You update the framework, it's going to generate a new event, and in just a few seconds we're going to start seeing some new insights probably coming. It's already here, 3 violations, and it's saying, hey, these policies are, or these services are actually using less replicas than it's supposed to. And you can do the same, like our applications being exposed in a different domain where they should be. Are they placed on a node where they should not be? As mentioned, our security, our network policy, right? Our applications exposed or communicating with other services where they shouldn't be. You can quickly keep on updating your security and get the report on how your applications perform. Different than most of the other solutions today or vendors, right? That they ask you to write those complex rules, cluster, and as you scale, it becomes super complex. And the same thing, great, Bruno, you're showing me from one cluster perspective. How do I do that now that I need to scale to my second cluster? Let's see it. The second cluster is going to be my EKS cluster. If I just remove my kubectl and I add my cluster, kubectl, get namespaces, I have my Magento prod here, right? Magento but prod, it's running, great. How do I connect Shipa to that cluster? It's pretty much the same thing. Let's go back to Shipa, and we're gonna come to frameworks again, and I'm gonna say, I'm gonna discover existing applications, and this one is gonna be a Magento prod. You pick a plan, fix the namespace, just like we did before. But now instead of connecting to a cluster, because this is a new cluster, or let's say it's the first time you start with Shipa, you're gonna have a no cluster here. You can leave it blank, and we're gonna connect it to a cluster after we create the framework. It uses the same thing, and I can say it's a Magento prod, for example. I'll do create. The framework is created, but it's not connected to my cluster yet, right? If I come to cluster and I say create, for example, now I'm gonna see my framework created here and available. If I have multiple frameworks or policy frameworks that I want to connect to multiple namespaces in my cluster, I can just select multiple here and do it all at once. And here I have to enter my Kubernetes control plane. You can get that with the command that Shipa gives you here. So if you just select this command and you run it in your cluster, it's gonna give you here. You can copy this, and if you go back to Shipa, for example, and just plop this in here and generate command, Shipa will give you a magic URL that you can just copy this, go back to your cluster, and run this. When you run this, Shipa will install its services, and we'll start deploying its agent in that cluster, and then we'll start monitoring the applications that you have, or our Magento prod, or whatever apps you have. And in a few seconds, you're gonna see your applications popping up here in a way that you can manage them, use this as your internal developer portal, see the logs of your application and everything, as well as the insights showing up here. I hope this was helpful and insightful. And you can see how different than most of the other solutions, you can quickly surface violations that you might have and address security concerns. Thank you.